Hello, welcome to another First Look. Thanks for being here this week as we're really rounding the bend now. We're really almost there to Christmas. This is Advent 4. It's the week that we talk about love, and at least if you're going on the Advent wreath situation, hopefully we're always talking about it a little bit. But this is the week where that's the focus when it comes to the Advent kind of calendar and wreath. But the passage that we're looking at here this week will not be any shock to you. It's the birth story of Jesus, right? So it's the story that you looked at 150 times, which I always love because I get an opportunity to see it from a different angle and to try to understand something that I didn't understand before. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do this time. If you haven't been able to be in worship with us every week, we're doing this series called Home by Another Way, and we're trying to dive in a little bit into the world of Jesus a little bit deeper to understand what the impact of the incarnation was in real time. We know what it is for us on some levels, but what is it in that moment? So trying to pull a little bit more out of the context of the story and try to focus on that kind of stuff. You can see that I'm in my office this week. I'm not walking, so if you really didn't like me doing this while I was walking, then you get a reprieve from that. And if you loved it, then sorry. I guess I can do this Anyway. So this is Matthew chapter 1, and this is the next part of Matthew chapter 1, because the genealogy that we just went through gave us kind of it's the setup, right? That's the first part of the gospel. It's the setup, and it gives us an understanding of this is what you're about to see. That's the preview. We know who has come before Jesus. We know how we got here. And so now this is the birth story. And I think one of the intriguing things about it is, for you and I, when we think about the gospel story, this is a natural place for us to begin. But the author that more times than not is attributed as being the one who wrote first, meaning Mark is the gospel that most experts would tell you is the first gospel that at least chronologically was written. And that Matthew, Luke, John, they all, in some way, shape, or form, pulled information from that original document. If you'll notice, Mark doesn't start with a birth narrative. So Luke and Matthew certainly have some similarities. And then John's is kind of looking at it from a macro sense, Jesus as light and the Word, and so looking at Jesus not from necessarily a birth narrative per se, but more of the eternal existence of the one who comes incarnate. And so that's what we see in John's gospel. Excuse me. But here in Matthew, we have a view that I think most of us associate with this time of year. If you look at our nativity scene, if you think about the Christmas cards that you get, this is kind of the scene that we think about. And so hopefully what I'll be doing this coming week is giving you kind of a slightly different perspective in this vein. We kind of look at Christmas sometimes in the same way that you might view it like if you were watching a Charlie Brown Christmas or something. There's nostalgia, there's quaintness, there's peace and kind of a calm. Everything feels good, and it should feel good. It's a good. That's part of the spirit of what we're doing from Advent into Christmas is conjuring, is, you know, looking for that and feeding off of that. Those are all wonderful things. But sometimes we can get a little bit lost in those nostalgic feelings. You know, it's like you might think back on your wedding or the birth of a child or something like that, and you only really remember the parts that were fantastic. And maybe some of the stuff that was a little not so fantastic or difficult maybe just slips your mind, or you kind of forget after a while. And part of this series is trying to understand as many elements as we can so that we get a fuller, richer picture of the incarnation. So my gut says that the sermon that you hear on Sunday will emphasize some of those elements with the hope that that will give you, again, this depth of understanding of the ins and outs of the experience. All right, so this is Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Just follow along as we go. Now, the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. Let me pause. So, you have probably heard me say this, but it's worth mentioning only because it comes up occasionally. The birth of Jesus. Probably not December 25th, right? That's not really when a census would be taken. And in reality, the reason that we celebrate Christmas at that time is because it was a way for us to kind of introduce a way of introducing Jesus to a non-Christian audience. So the non-Christian audiences in the greater Roman Empire would have been celebrating things around the solstice, the winter solstice. And, you know, science was, you know, not as good then as it is now. And the date that many of those traditions had around the winter solstice was December 25th. And basically celebrating Christmas on that date is a way of saying, hey, you all have your darkness to light celebration, you know, where everything is renewed and we celebrate the light. Let us tell you a little bit about the light of Jesus, you know, the one who takes us from darkness to light. And so, you know, that's a pretty good evangelistic tool, you know. And so the idea that Jesus is born on a particular date isn't as important, obviously, as what his birth represents. So that comes up occasionally. I think I've talked about it on different, you know, newsletters and stuff like that. But again, always worth mentioning in case you haven't heard it. All right. So now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what was been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and there shall be his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. Okay. A couple of things. And some of these are probably things you've heard, but heard me say over the last few years, but they're worth repeating simply because this is a first look, and at least it gives you kind of a base. So the first thing we see there is the disgrace part. And you have a system in place where that was a real and present danger, not only to Joseph, but to Mary and to their family. And it's almost shocking when you think about it now. I mean, given what we know and given who we are and given the story and given all those things. Just the idea that something almost went a different way. And I don't think we ever really talk about that. Joseph almost just called everything off. And that, just the idea of that story, where Joseph and Mary go in different directions, is a pretty shocking one when you think about what we know. Now, I don't know exactly what that would have done for Mary, other than she was a pregnant woman that maybe they could have made up whatever story they wanted to, and her family could have kept her out of the public eye, and they could have done something. I don't know exactly what would have happened if what we know happened didn't happen. But that was where they were. For some reason, it was better for Joseph and for Mary for them to hypothetically not be together than for him to marry her and for that to be public. There was more protection, I guess, for her in the situation that they were planning, or he was planning, than in them getting married and that happening in a public way. That's the kind of thing I'd like to explore a little bit more about, why it is that it's better for Mary if that didn't happen, or is that really just better for Joseph in the public sphere, or maybe it's better for Mary in the long term. I don't really know that part, so that's something I'd like to really understand. I just kind of took that for granted. I always sort of take that fact for granted, that that's why he was doing that, was to keep everything out of the public kind of sphere. But that's what was happening. So it's kind of intriguing to think about. What if Joseph would have just said, I'm done? Because he could have. I mean, this dream, if he doesn't even take that seriously, I mean, is there a possibility that Joseph could have had that dream with the angel and everything and just gone, well, that was weird, and went back to sleep? Like, that's the kind of thing that we just sort of take for granted. Like, of course he thinks this, of course he pays attention to the dream, of course he goes through with it, of course he remains, of course he goes on to marry Mary. That's stuff that we just kind of bypass. The what if part, I think that's a really fascinating one, because there are certainly circumstances in just the world that you and I exist in where the person in Joseph, in his position, makes another decision. Like, that wouldn't have been shocking. It doesn't even occur to us, because it's like, well, it's Joseph and it's Jesus and it's Mary, so of course. But they're not in scripture. This is happening in real time. This isn't history. This is happening in real time. So that's a fascinating element to it. But the disgrace part, I think, is, that speaks a lot to a lot of things. When you think about the world that existed in that time and place 2,000 years ago, but you also think about, even what that means now. There are it's probably a little bit easier if that situation happened today, where two people are engaged, she's pregnant, she's saying that it happened miraculously, all those kind of things kind of come up. But it's at the time, couldn't have been more serious, and not just serious like in the sense of um, shameful. But I would imagine that we just read this whole genealogy of Jesus, and in that um, genealogy we have Tamar, and Tamar um, conceives a child with her father-in-law Judah, and in a deception, and the fact that she was pregnant and not married, like that was, that could have meant her death, um, if she would not have proven what she went on to prove. And I don't know exactly what the rules were um, in the time that Mary lived. Um, Certainly, there's a whole lot of time, generations and generations of time between Judah's time, Tamar's time, and Mary's. But the rules were still very harsh, and that speaks a lot to the culture she was in, and the um, how those systems were set up. The fact that she would have been the one who was in trouble. She would have one who was the bearer of the shame, not whoever the man was in this story, but more her. She would have, that says a lot about a lot of things. But that's where the context was, and just the fact that you have, a story like Tamar in that genealogy, and then you have this one, kind of this juxtaposition of, um, a deception meant to preserve her life, but then this lack of deception in Mary's story. That's an interesting contrast. Um, but both of them are women who endure, and both of them um, take what is given to them and try to do what they believe will either be faithful or um, will help to secure their own safety and what have you, and that for their loved ones. So it's a really interesting thing to have this story of these women in the genealogy, Tamar and Bathsheba, and of course and Rahab and Ruth, up against this story here of Mary and her, conceiving and whatever. Those are just really interesting things to have a part of that. And it also, of course, speaks a lot to the world that Jesus was born into. Because, we may have a situation where Joseph believed what Mary was saying, and we may have a situation where, even the wise men believed what was being said. But you have to wonder, are there people in her life that didn't believe her? Elizabeth did, her cousin Elizabeth, and she in Luke we see that whole thing, and Mary's song and all of that. And of course, we don't doubt that for a moment. But, I think one of the interesting things that we also don't talk about is there's probably friends of Mary's who are like, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, that's fine. Like, that had to have happened. We don't talk about that part either, but it had to have happened. And so you have this really kind of muddled beginning. And then when you think about, them having to be refugees in Egypt and escaping persecution and all, it's a really messy beginning. And the incarnation is I think one of the things that I find intriguing about it is we clean up the story, nativity scene, Charlie Brown Christmas, we clean up the story, but it's anything but. And even when you look at the story as it's attached to Isaiah, we've been going back and forth between Isaiah and the gospel stories. The Messiah figure that is promised, that Isaiah is talking about, is coming into the world and helping to kind of protect and preserve the people, or reestablish and restore the people. Um, but there couldn't have been a messier situation for that Messiah to restore than the exile. I mean, it is a brutal and um, catastrophic moment for the people of Israel, that everything is taken away. You know, they are taken from their homes, um, because of a power, an empire, and Jesus and his family have to flee from their homes because of an emperor. But instead of foreign, it's domestic. Within the Isaiah story, a foreign empire comes in and invades, where in the Jesus story, a domestic empire is invading Bethlehem, and they have to flee to a foreign land. So it's like, I like that sort of the juxtaposition of those two things. The domestic versus foreign empires and safety, and where we find all of that. All of that is really interesting. Also, just as an aside, the title of my sermon, I think, is "Name Him Jesus," and name him Jesus. Jesus is the adapted name that we use because of the translation from Hebrew to Greek. They would have known him by his Hebrew name. The name Jesus in Hebrew is Yeshua or Joshua. So to Mary, and again, Mary's name isn't Mary. That's not a Hebrew name. Her actual Hebrew name is Miriam. But Joseph is a Hebrew name. So Joseph and Miriam have a child named Joshua. I know you've heard me say that before too, but sometimes I need those reminders that Joseph didn't go around saying, Jesus, dinner time. It was Yeshua, dinner time. Just something to think about. And the reason I mention it is because, again, we're trying to see the world that he's in as clearly as possible. So in this story, I want to really talk about the challenges, in the impossible kind of situation that Jesus is born into, and what that means for the way that we see our faith. That's really important to me. The decisions of Joseph, the decisions and reaction of Mary, the world that they're in, all of that is a violent, chaotic kind of place. And to say that this little family that's being formed here was under great duress is an understatement. And I think it's a fascinating element to what the incarnation means. God enters into not something that is gentle and sweet and calm, but something that is high intensity and comes with a really high stakes. And what that says for the way we approach the season. That's what I'm thinking about this week, is just what that means for us. So that's what I have. Take a look at the story. Try to imagine the world that you're in. It's good, I think, to have those kind of calm and those kind of calming moments when we think about what Christmas is. Because, if you've had a child, or you've been in, around people who have, for as chaotic and whatever as it is, and I'm speaking, of course, from the father perspective, there's still a moment when the world stops and everything is unbelievable. That still exists. And so we can celebrate that in the birth of Jesus, but we also, recognize all of the story. So that's what we're going to do a little bit this week. So thank you for thinking through all of this. Thanks for being who you are. If I can, I'll give you a reminder that of some things this week. First, there is no Advent Adventures this week, but there will be on the 21st. This week, the youth have a 319 Christmas party at Highland, so we're just taking the week off. But we will have it on the 21st. And also remember that Bill Marcus will be here for Sunday school this week as well. Just a couple of things to know about the week. All right. Thank you so much for being you. Thanks for doing this with me. And I will see you next time for another First Look. Take care.